welcome everyone. I understand you've been involved in quite a few workshops up to this date, so I'm really pleased to be able to be here today. I've been sitting in front of a computer most of the week, so it's nice to get out. So my name's Emma. I'm based at Lancaster University, and I've worked at Lancaster for around 10 years. And the research that I do most is what we call qualitative research, and we'll be going into that more in the session today. But my background really is before that was working a lot with kind of charitable organisations and local government and national government. So I got really used to having to do evaluations really quickly, or responding really quickly to kind of local needs and making sure that what we were doing was kind of relevant to local needs. So that's something that stuck with me a bit as I've kind of worked in universities, which can sometimes end up feeling a little bit distant from kind of what's happening within local services and communities. So hopefully some of the things we can talk about today, I'll draw on some of the projects that I've been working on in different situations, but because we're quite a small group as well, there's plenty of space as well for people to kind of bring their own projects in and examples, or if people have things they want to just raise to say, actually I'd like some advice or some thoughts from other people in the group or myself or colleagues here to talk through, then yeah, we can sort of stop and go through. So yeah, so I've got slides to go through and we've got some activities to do, but we can sort of keep it fairly open to how we use the time. I'm sure that you'll maybe know each other, but because I don't know anyone, could we just do some really quick introductions? Say a little bit about what we'll cover today. Very much what we hopefully sort of said in the kind of the programme. So just really much kind of an introduction to start with as to what we mean by qualitative methods, and understand that when we in a workshop situation, people have different levels of experience and skills. So please if you feel anything's unclear, just please ask, or if I've got some ideas as well of things I've not covered, then please add those as well. We'll talk a bit about some using qualitative methods in evaluation as well. And I thought, because it's a relatively short session, I'll talk a bit about the most sort of two common, I guess, approaches that you often hear with qualitative methods of interviews and focus groups, and just some sort of practical tips if you're thinking about using those sorts of approaches in your work locally. And then hopefully we'll have a sort of break around halfway through for some coffee, and we'll also be then sort of talking about how we can use or go on to make sense of qualitative data, so how we analyse and bring it together to make a kind of coherent story for reporting. And then just towards the end of time, also touch on some of the kind of the more sort of issues around sort of safeguarding or ethical issues, which I think will be very similar to sort of the issues that will arise in your work day to day as well, but things as researchers we have to think about as well. And before we sort of move on to the main session, there are of course always in any sort of sessions there can be sort of a lot of jargon. I think I've probably mentioned at least three. I've said evaluation, I've said qualitative, I've said analysis. There may be other terms as well. So if there's anything that they just do ask, or put it on a post-it note, and if anything is unclear. So what I'll just do, I wanted to sort of start with. You've talked a bit about the kind of the work you're doing day to day into the food banks or the support services you're provided. I suppose just generally, what are people's experiences around? Are you involved in evaluations more generally, or are qualitative approaches something you think you may have used in your work, or you've used?
I know we've, I'm at the moment having to write up documents to get funding. So we do use qualitative in a way, because we support families who have got disabled children. So a lot of our work is they say we're great, we help out, everything like this, but we can't actually measure it, if you like, in figures. So we use a lot of, what people have said about us and the support that we can provide. But yeah, actually getting to measure it, that's kind of what we struggle with.
And we can talk a bit more about that as well. You know, there's because you maybe want to do both in terms of using what my colleagues might talk about as kind of quantitative data or surveys or specific measures to kind of look at things like mental health or well-being. But actually, as you said, the feedback you're getting through the client's experiences is what we might call qualitative data, but that has some really valuable insights as well in terms of talking about the differences services can make, as I'm sure you've experienced. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm a bit the same. Like we have a lot of like project works in the Nibbles Training Cafe. It's about sort of capturing that journey and how we can use that sort of, like you say, to refer back to or as evidence. But we're sort of the same, like struggling to how we capture it, how we document it, and how it should look so that it's sort of like readable, if you will, and quick and easy. Like, so a bit like Jenny. How we put it down on paper, really.
I'm trying to measure the distance travelled for people. So that was the problem. That's what we did about the problem, and that was the impact. So measuring impact of being able to access priceless food, and what difference does that make to your life, and how that is presented in a format that is quite easy. With case studies. Lots of feedback and everything's very positive. But it's how to measure the distance. I mean, I can't always get that due to the nature of because we are a distribution of food. We don't work with the end user, the clients. So I work with the network, the organisations who work with the clients. Some get lots of feedback and do lots of consultations, etc. But to actually put that down and to put it in some way that is measurable, to measure the impact of what's happening. Be interested to find out a bit more about that.
We've actually just been one of the projects we've been asked to support recently. It's not around food security, but it's about access to crisis support, whether that's furniture or support around some housing, and so not dissimilar actually in terms of the point that people are kind of approaching the services for support, but then actually the challenge about how do you then look at what impact or difference that may, particularly when people might not be in the same address, or as you said, you're not in direct contact with those individuals, so that can be sometimes really challenging as well.
I think one of the main things, there's a lot of information, just how to present it. Taking from that same name sheet.
And like you say as well, proving that impact that it has on the community.
Because people give you funding, but they want you to tell them what differences that made.
And I guess the trouble is when you have lots of different funders as well, they're all wanting to tell you slightly different things as well, which is then so it's.
I'm the opposite way round. I'm actually the one, in order to design my services and my business, I actually use the qualitative research. So this is where I've noticed the problems are, like you said, I can only go off what I see. So lots of organisations, like you said, you're not putting the information up, I can't see it, so I'm thinking the service is not needed because you've all that I don't know of it. It's only when I started coming to the focus group, this one and the other one, that I'm starting to see actually how things are, just because I can't see, I can only go off what's printed. Or I even spoke to another person who re-attended one of her conferences. I've gone off their website, or what they've put up, and then I spoke to her about this research group, like, but we don't publish it. So other people outside who don't know the organisation don't even know who they are or what they do. So she's now looking into that. And I think this is the problem with research. One, you need to know what you're looking for. Sometimes it's hidden as well in certain key words. Just for example, like food insecurity. Unless you're working in that sector, you don't know about it, food poverty, unless you hear it on the news. Or like in digital poverty, like we started specialising. So we didn't know where food poverty is. It's only because stuff had been put out, or because of COVID, a lot of stuff came up. It's always been there, like with food banks. We just thought it's a new thing until my daughter and I researched. Right back into the early 2000s, food banks are actually going, but we just assume it's a new thing because we're only hearing about it now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think often, that so all that effort gets put into doing the research, and and then if it's university, traditionally maybe there was a bit of a focus on just things getting published in academic journals, and which actually not everyone could access because you had to pay to access them as well, or like you said, they're quite hard to kind of navigate. So hopefully, I think since I've been at Lancaster, it feels like the tide has turned a bit in terms of actually much more kind of emphasis on ensuring research is accessible and usable. But as you say as well, there's so much research that's done within local organisations which could be really valuable for other people as well in terms of that learning. It's hopefully these kind of projects as well sort of provide the space to kind of share that as well. But yeah, let's come back to that later. So we've talked a lot about sort of qualitative research approaches already. So what we're basically talking about when we're very crudely, I guess, when we're talking about the difference between what we might call quantitative approaches and qualitative. I mean, qualitative approaches are often explained in terms of text or words, and also of people's lived experiences. So about how people make sense of the world and understand the world. Whereas often, I guess what quantitative approaches you tend to think traditionally are more about sort of numbers and statistics. You might collect about the numbers of people who went into a service, maybe the kind of a survey that's done which tells you about the percentage of people who were physically activity, or the percentage of people who've received support or benefited from support, or whose mental health improved. I think in practice, I think we certainly in the research I do, we tend to sort of draw on a whole range of approaches. So we don't necessarily just do a project which is just using qualitative approaches or going out and interviewing people. We might say, well, we've got this question we've got this project where we're tasked with looking at whether it made a difference to a local community, and we might want to use some data that's collected through the services, so the people who we reached and used it, but we also might want to do some additional work through qualitative work to find out more about the kind of experiences or differences it made as well. So we can sort of talk a bit more about that. But actually qualitative research can sort of, qualitative methods can involve lots of different things. So I think often traditionally we think about sort of interviews or focus groups, but it can actually involve a researcher or somebody involved doing the research, observing a meeting like this. It might be to see, what sort of issues were discussed, what were the dynamics in the group, and they would sort of record that as part of sort of capturing their understanding of the service or the project. Surveys, I mean, we traditionally think of surveys as being having more sort of tick box questions, which, it's more about, like a Likert scale or yes, or, did this make a difference, I agree, disagree sort of thing. But actually, surveys as well might capture qualitative experiences if they have to have boxes where people might write something about their experiences or feedback as well, so you call that sort of qualitative. Another example I'll talk about today is using diaries to look at people's experiences, so sort of self-completion diaries, and they've been used in a whole range of topic areas where people have sort of caring responsibilities to capture their experiences. We used them actually in lockdown during COVID. I've said surveys twice, not because it's more important than anything else. Another more creative approaches, which I understand there's going to be a session on perhaps using things like photos or videos, so I'm not going to talk about that today, but again, that's sort of often seen as a more sort of qualitative approach as well. So are there any other, I suppose, things you to add to that, or anything that would surprise you on that? No. So I guess then, just thinking about evaluation more generally, so whether it doesn't matter what, not thinking about qualitative approaches particularly, I guess when we think about evaluation, so if you're writing your report for your funder, what sort of things are you sort of being asked to report, or are you personally wanting to find out about sort of the difference that service made?
I haven't done any evaluation.
I've done any evaluations, that's right.
I'm fairly new to my role.
Yeah.
I think what we try to gather ultimately is, which is quite difficult actually, is the resilience that's built within the family through our support, so that we try, ultimately to build parent carers' skills up and confidence up to be able to manage school meetings, to contact professionals, to know the pathways for diagnosis, things like that. So and this is kind of what is quite difficult to measure, because we have got questionnaires, say between 1 and 5, how helpful has it been and that, but just their words is what we need to be able to present.
Yeah.
I have put things into, measure them. I've done some of the soft questionnaires, not with the end users but with the organisations. So from feedback from them, I've been able to sort of pull together some percentage of how many felt this was better and did better. But that's pretty well as far as I've gone with. But whatever the question was, and the amount of people who responded, percentage of them said that was favourable or not. So
Yeah.
Just quite basic really, but it's wow.
Yeah, well, and even that takes time, doesn't it? It's But it's still not measuring the impact really. In some ways I suppose it does, but it's the distance of some, that's where they started, that's what we did, that's it. How do I present that? Thank you. Hi, welcome.
Good morning. Apologies for
No, not at all. I'm Emma, and we're just really getting started and talking about qualitative approaches and just talking a bit about experiences. So do you know everyone here?
not everybody, I don't think, know most people. So good morning everyone. I'm Sam Richardson and I'm the co-research officer as part of the Health Determinants Research Collaboration, which was a new programme that is funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, and Blackpool is one of 13 local authorities that has received some funding to try and explore wider determinants of health, kind of with the primary objective of making sure that in the future the local authority makes decisions around its policy and research based on what's already happened, so becoming a more research-informed local authority, basically. I hope that's a helpful
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. I know I've met some of you before in different workshops, but for those that haven't, hello.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just bring up this box, which gives examples of if with an evaluation it can look at a whole range of different types of questions. So the most obvious ones we often think about were actually who did the project or the service reach. As we've talked about already, what sort of difference do we think it's making, and the kind of the challenges of actually trying to capture that as well. But as well, an evaluation may also explore and help us to get a better understanding of how the service was or a project was delivered in practice, and how that was experienced by either the people receiving it or the people delivering it. So it might be about understanding the relevance or the acceptability of how a project was rolled out. So an example of recently, I've been asked to do an evaluation of a indoor air quality campaign. So tenants in social housing were being asked to install a monitor in their home, and to look at, then that monitor will be collecting data with an idea of, and the families will get support around how they can improve the quality of air in their homes. So addressing things like opening windows, damp and so on. So part of the project was actually really important to understand how those households experienced having that monitor in the home, and that there was quite a lot of practical learning about that, which perhaps hadn't been understood at the start of the project. And then as well, that project as well was then looking at we could understand the impact in terms of the data that we gathered through the monitor, because that told you quite sort of the statistics about I can't even think of what the carbon monoxide and all the sort of the various kind of measures you can collect, which are more scientific, I guess. But as you were saying, it didn't tell you anything about the issues that affected indoor air quality in the home. So actually, if people were, there was a lot of damp in the home and people were drying their clothes inside, that wasn't because they didn't realise that wasn't the good thing to do, it's because they had no outdoor space, or they didn't want to dry their clothes outdoors for other reasons because they were concerned about safety and things. So that qualitative element was really helpful in just, I suppose, understanding how that kind of what seemed like quite a simple project about having a monitor, actually what that meant in terms of the context of people's lives and what the learning was in terms of how you might deliver that again in future. And then the other things I guess that relates to are about understanding are things working well and what are things working less well as well. And we can sort of talk about some examples of that through more sort of tangible projects. So that might broadly be kind of split into understanding the impact of a project and understanding how a project's delivered and the process of delivering that, and how you might make changes to a project to increase its effectiveness or maximise the benefits for the people it's intending to make a difference for. And then in answering those questions, you could use health economics. You've already sort of got value, actually the cost of value, that might be another question. So I think some people may be attending a session on health economics. You could use sort of more quantitative approaches we've talked about, we could use qualitative approaches, but we could sort of use a sort of combination of both. And I think actually qualitative, what I think traditionally people have thought, qualitative is a bit sort of second, it can't tell you much about impact, but actually in our experiences we can use qualitative methods both for understanding how a project's delivered and the things that worked well and didn't work well, but actually sometimes those qualitative approaches capture the sort of smaller or more nuanced differences that maybe a survey can't capture. So with a survey you might be able to reach a much bigger number of, sort of a bigger sample of people, a bigger group of people who've maybe been involved in a service. Say it's maybe I'll put an example in a minute about leisure services, which is quite a tangible example of that. But actually, if you want to, as you said, you want to sort of dig a bit deeper about understanding resilience or the kind of people's well-being, as well as maybe using sort of measures, things that kind of measure that. You might want to sort of understand people's narratives and stories alongside that as well. Okay. So here's an example I prepared earlier. So this is a project that happened in the Northwest. It was also in Blackpool. So we were asked by local authorities in the Northwest. Sorry, am I in your way there? In the Northwest so it was about 2015-16, and councils were having to make some quite hard decisions about how they were investing, particularly in leisure services. So should they be investing in sort of free and concessionary leisure that you get, that you can access at leisure centres to go to the gym or to go for a swim. And what we realised across the Northwest, that councils were doing it in a whole range of different ways. So for example in Blackpool they were providing free leisure for children during the school holidays. I'm not sure they still do that. Do they still do that? That's good. Oh, they don't?
Well, they do it, but I don't use it.
No.
There's only 2 leisure centres here and I can't get to both of them. I was getting a drive, so I don't use it.
That's good. Well, that was a finding from our research as well in terms of transport. But then we were looking in other areas in Blackburn at the time. They had what we called a community-wide free leisure initiative called Refresh. So basically, it was open to anyone to use the leisure centres for free at certain times of the day. And then in other areas, they did they perhaps had concessionary cards and did other kind of schemes. So we were interested in working with the local authorities to look at actually what sort of, do those schemes actually make a difference? Do they enable people particularly people who are experiencing inequalities around physical activity to become more active? So the evaluation, I'll read it because I think I'm not sure how easy it is to read from these at the back of the room. It says, so we undertook an evaluation looking at whether schemes to make leisure facilities more affordable through concessions or free leisure improve physical activities in local communities. So we interviewed leisure professionals to understand more about different schemes being delivered. We used information collected from leisure facilities to understand who use these schemes, and we ran focus groups with 80 members of the public to find out about how cost effective their ability to be active. So which out of what we did, which would you sort of identify as maybe the more qualitative approaches that we took?
Focus
So interviews.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Interviewed.
That's right, yes. Yeah, so those are the main things we did in terms of the qualitative approaches within the project. We had those interviews with the people who are had quite strategic roles in the leisure services and also public health as well, to understand about what was influencing their decision around providing these schemes, and what did they see as the kind of the aims of it, what were their kind of goals. And then obviously the focus groups with members of the public, although our primary interest was actually in how cost affects people's use in terms of affordability. What we also wanted to understand, because we knew from the evidence more generally that it might be a whole range of factors that influence people's decisions to be active. So you gave a perfect example there of talking about the challenges of transport in terms of people accessing
It's
schemes.
really been so bad, but I actually had Blackpool sports events on my doorstep, but then I was going to do a swimming pool. I've now got everything cows, but I don't have that. But that's what's funny you brought this up, because every time I went to the park, I would complain at their tennis court, because I was taking my kids to Poulton to use the private one there, and then now they're putting in the tennis court. However, for us, it's not as bad, like £5 I think it's going to be, but there's other free ones around. So I guess it just depends on what part of Blackpool you're living in. It is.
So that's absolutely that kind of proximity and sort of access. But in terms of thinking about the so that's a quote from one of the people who took part, so talking about, actually this was a few years ago, so the price of milk and bread is probably nothing like this now. But so people actually saying actually we could see the amenities there, but we couldn't afford to go into them and use them. In terms of one of the things we did want to look at with this evaluation was the impact. So actually, is it making any difference to physical activity, and whose physical activity, who is it reaching? So the main way we did that was through using quantitative data. So my colleagues who worked at Liverpool University were able to work with the local authority providers. So when you go into a leisure centre, you kind of swipe, if you have a membership card, you kind of swipe it. So each time that's swiped, that's collecting some information about who's using it and how many times you've been in. So they managed to access all that swipe data from the leisure centres, which is like millions of transactions across, sort of 4 or 5 areas. And then, I don't know what they did with that, to be honest, because I don't work with numbers, but very much had to sort of try and make that into a usable format so they could look at comparisons across different areas. So from that they were able, as far as they could, to see actually information about the breakdown by gender or families going in. There were some real gaps in that data because often information around ethnicity wasn't collected. So that was a sort of challenge as well for that. But what they were also able to do is look at survey data that's collected through things like the Sports England, of how physical activity surveys that go out around the country. So they were able to access that data that was collected for those particular areas and use that data to look at impact as well. But what our focus groups did, and we actually ended up doing some telephone interviews as well with individuals who couldn't make those sessions, also helped us understand other sorts of differences and impacts as well. So particularly when we spoke to people, say, using facilities in the day, so people who were particularly retired or older adults. So people talked a lot about the social benefits of going to leisure centres and having that opportunity to have that routine, interacting, not necessarily socialising, but just being able to say, oh, hi there, so it's the familiar faces. So pretty very much like a sort of coming to a centre like this. And then people also, as we've talked about all the constraints as well to being physically active, even though if leisure was free or there was lots of other things like childcare or timing and so on, which made a difference. So again, those sort of that qualitative work helped to really sort of tease out what it means to try and be physical activity in the context of somebody's life, but it also helped to capture some of those impacts which we wouldn't have seen through these sort of survey data, because those surveys just didn't ask those sorts of questions as well. how's that sound so far? Is that make sense? So the second example I've got here is a really different actually. It was during lockdown, the first lockdown in 2020. So as a qualitative researcher, that was really challenging because a lot of, the last sort of 8-9 years I'd spent my time, going out to areas, travelling to meet people face to face, running focus groups, so much that happens face to face when it's a qualitative work or community work. So as everyone, we all had to sort of try and adjust and do things a bit differently. So one of the projects within an initiative we're involved with in the Northwest, which is a kind of research universities who are working together with and has quite a strong sort of, public involvement network as well of members of the public who are interested in research. We got chatting to them about perhaps trying to do a project which could capture public experiences of that initial lockdown. And we didn't really have any money to do it, we didn't have any extra money, and we hadn't used diaries in that sort of situation before, so we really wanted to learn about how that would work, and so understanding if that method was an appropriate method to use, but also try and capture that experience of lockdown as well. So we designed sort of online diaries that people completed at home. So obviously that people downloaded that from a kind of a web form, and then they sort of completed it and could send it back. And they did that over 8 weeks on a weekly basis. And we also sort of organised sort of a weekly sort of catch up and check in with people as well, to talk about if things were going well, and to explore in a bit more detail some of the things people had mentioned in the diaries as well. And we kept them really open, so we weren't too prescriptive about what we wanted people to record, but we did sort of, we wanted people to reflect on what they'd been doing that week, their kind of experiences in the wider community as well. So a few different things came through that. One of the things that was really interesting was the community. Because there were people who were also very active in their communities. They had a really good perspective on the kind of how that was working locally and the kind of the volunteering work that was happening. But another thing that really came through was around sort of mental health, which we obviously know now continues to be a massive thing, linked to the pandemic. And people, really talked about sort of feeling these kind of ups and downs in their emotions over the period of recording the diaries. So the thing that was, I think, really useful about sort of having a diary approach is that you got that really regular capture, recording of people's experiences and feelings and over a period of time, rather than if you're doing an interview, you often just go and, like today, we meet for once, you have to say remember everything in that sort of 1 to 45-minute slot. Whereas this, allow people a bit more time to kind of reflect over essentially a 2-month period. So I think in terms of those sorts of approaches, the benefits of that was that sort of that longitudinal. I think you were talking about like how do you capture to keep people's journeys, isn't it, over a period of time. But obviously the challenge as well with things like diaries is that they're self-completed. So you're relying on people, sometimes people will start really positively and be really enthusiastic. By week 4, it's like, oh, got to fill this out again. So actually having those weekly meetings or sessions with people were quite helpful in just keeping people's motivation or checking if there was anything that was problematic. And sometimes, some weeks, people just weren't able to obviously complete because they were dealing with the impact of the pandemic as well. So that was absolutely fine. So yeah, that's been an approach I've then gone on to use in other projects as well with professionals recently. And again, people were a little bit apprehensive about recording a diary or worried about the time commitments. But actually in both projects, what people reflected at the end is that they felt it was quite useful as a time for some space or some reflective time, which I guess diaries are more generally. So certainly in the lockdown diaries, people talking about it being quite therapeutic to sort of to record and reflect on their experiences if they were facing really sort of stressful times during that period as well.
We did something like this in lockdown, but it was telephone calls, so we made 4,500 calls over a 12-month period, and we logged them, every single one was logged. And then just off my own back, I did something quite creative, you know, like the word scrambles that you have. So each month, I would put them into a word scramble, so it would shoot out all these words that are common themes. So whether it be depressed, lonely, you know, or all the, and you could see the theme throughout the 12 months, how it started off quite positive, and then it had a real dip, you know, people hit a real low,
It did, yeah.
and then sort of started to come out a bit at the other end, but it was really good to see, because I printed them off for the team and like made them really colourful and things like that. So there was like a really good conversation started, because it like say things like depressed, lonely, missing my friends, missing services, enjoying time in the garden, planting, gardening, neighbours, you know, and it just was chucking out all it, but it was really good, it was really creative, but it was a lot of work. There was 4 of us, and we'd call every client that accessed our service every week and log it.
Yeah.
But Excel was really good for that, because then you could sort of categorise it, so you could sort of put it into themes or individuals, and it would just give you a whole pattern of their conversations over the 12 months. It was a lot of work, but it was really good, and it was really, what's the word, like, I felt really good after it, and after I started seeing these sort of word scrambles.
There's all sorts you could do with that, like by age and stuff as well, couldn't
Yeah.
you? And see how it affected different age populations, different demographics and stuff like that in terms of...
People who lived in supported living, or those that lived with elderly parents, people who lived with siblings, people who were still maybe doing things that they shouldn't be doing, because they would just be like, well, I've been here today, and you'd be like, oh no, you shouldn't be out doing that. You know, we won't ever to do that, or, you know, I need to see my GP, I've not seen my GP, I'm not having communications with anybody. So you'd get these regular themes. So, but we sort of just got that, and I don't really know what, I'm listening to you and thinking, maybe we should have shared that with somebody, because it's a lot of information, obviously it's sensitive information.
Absolutely,
but, you know, that's sort of like a project in itself, isn't it?
Sorry, I missed at the beginning instructions. Which organisation do you work for?
I'm called a New Langdale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think I've seen you about with Neil.
Yeah, because
Neil
I work at Whitegate Manor,
Yeah.
next to where I was.
Yeah, Beeson.
Yeah.
So Neil was part of that. So Neil was my manager, and he sort of led this project. And he's really positive and really encouraging like that. He's a great guy. But listening now and thinking, we've sort of done a massive project with itself there, haven't we?
You have, it's huge.
A massive, So when we obviously Excel told us there's 4,500 calls that we made.
You know, I hope you don't mind me offering this as an observation. It's just really interesting though, because you know how you were saying almost like, oh, like, what do we do with it almost?
Yeah.
We can almost find ourselves in that position, can't we, where we've got lots of information and we're a bit like, oh, but why are we collecting that now? What do we do with it all?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That
Well,
can
that's
be
what
quite...
I feel like
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Like, I feel like I should have shared that with somebody. It might have been vital, really good information with somebody.
I suppose I would go back to the beginning in terms... Sorry, I'm not trying to... But just in terms of, like, why were you collecting it in the first place? Because that might help you decide what you want to do with it a little bit more. Like, was it for internal purposes? Did you... What was it to help you with?
It was more just to keep people connected.
Okay.
It was more just for like, you know, sort of for like mental health and things like that. Just people wasn't sort of isolated at home. So it was mainly on that grounds. But we got quite a lot of information, and then obviously we built up a lot of relationships and a lot of trust as well over that time, which I feel really benefited our service afterwards, because people wasn't so reluctant to keep things to themselves. You know, they've been telling me every week what they've been doing, what they've been having for the tea, what they like on telly. So it made it really easy when we all came back together to continue that sort of transparent relationship. You know, not to be so close, not to be fearful. Like if I ring up and say just a courtesy call. You know, sometimes you get that stigma, don't you? People don't want to share things with you. Whereas now, it's not like that. Everyone's sharing everything. But it's really good, built up really good relationships.
It's a very positive thing from COVID then, isn't it?
I feel like us, as a service Langdale, we had a lot of positive change from COVID. So a lot of things changed within our service. I think about 6 months down the line during that project, we started doing outreach. So those that was identified as really needing care and support at home, with obviously correct policies and procedures and permissions in place, we'd start visiting them, or we'd meet in a park when that was allowed, things like that. So lots of things came from it, really good, positive things. But yeah, I'm going to go back, I'm going to speak to Neil and maybe say, you know, do we should we really put it out there? 4,500 calls is a lot of information.
And it's actually, Ralph, we have a chat maybe at lunch or something, but yeah, rather you can, there's sort of, it's funding you can apply for to sometimes to since what you're doing is doing to do more with data than you'd originally intended to.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's opportunities to do that with data like that.
Because that's just something I wouldn't know what to do. That it's obviously it's stored
Yes.
on our teams,
Yeah.
you know, within our organisation, it's somewhere on there. But,
Great stuff, brilliant example, thank you. So I'll go back to in this final sort of bit before we sort of stop to just to look at more of an activity-based task, is to just reflect briefly on or recap on things like interviews and focus groups, and knowing that people have sort of different experience of maybe being involved in as a participant or kind of leading them. So essentially interviews, when you talk about interviews, so usually they tend to be one-to-one sessions where a researcher or an interviewer and the person who you're wanting to speak about their experience, who we might refer to as a participant, and that might be a client, it might be a member of the public, it might be a professional. We've done interviews which could be paired as well, so it might be speaking to sort of two people at the same time because they have, I did one last week in fact, because they're working on the same service, they're sort of doing sharing the role essentially, so it made sense to sort of chat to them together. And you're very much about sort of exploring people's views and beliefs or experiences of, in evaluation it might be of their experiences of the project or the service that was delivered, so maybe like an outreach service to understand what difference that made, or it might be more generally to understand about sort of the issues around sort of food insecurity, or sort of understanding more about sort of people's experiences of that without any sort of view to sort of evaluating a particular service. And interviews can be useful because they can be very personally focused, so you're very much focusing on that individual's experience, and it allows you to sort of adapt a bit more and tailor it to that individual as you sort of have the conversation. And we'll sort of say a bit more about that when it comes to sort of thinking about asking questions. And then in focus groups, it's not entirely different. You're obviously, it might be a session a bit like today. You've got sort of a group of up to say 10 to 12 people in the room or online increasingly, where you're talking about a specific topic, or like my sort of leisure example about people's experiences of using leisure services. And some of the practical benefits of focus groups is that you can sort of maybe access a larger number of people more quickly in terms of bringing people together, although the practicalities can be sort of quite challenging as well with that. And you're having, and particularly if it's a topic which maybe people might have different perspectives on, it's quite useful because then that can, if it's facilitated well, it can be more of a discussion between the participants as well, rather than it just being a sort of a question and answer session, so more of a good conversation. But of course, that sort of context or that sort of approach might not be appropriate if you're talking about issues which are particularly sensitive or personal to individuals, or people might feel very uncomfortable in a sort of group situation talking about situations. So if depending on obviously people's funding and time for a project, it might be in some situations you have a sort of combination of both, or it might be you can only offer sort of one or the other approach. I think as well with traditionally as well with interviews and focus groups and research more generally, that it can sometimes feel you forget the sort of the power dynamics in that sort of context, and actually if you're an interviewer, it can feel you forget how, as a researcher, you can forget how intimidating that might feel to somebody who is maybe unfamiliar with research, is meeting somebody they don't know. They might be coming to their home, and asking all these questions about something which is potentially quite challenging for them to talk about. So there's lots of kind of issues to think about in terms of how those interviews or focus groups are sort of set up to make sure people feel supported on, and those sessions aren't leading people to go away with a really negative experience, or even doing harm because they've caused distress by having sort of exposing lots of issues, but then there's not been any sort of follow-up support for people. And just quickly, has anyone ever either run an interview or focus group or been involved in one themselves? Yeah. How was your experience with that? Were you running it, or?
I've been involved in both, but so I think in terms of the learning that I gained from it was, I think invariably you end up learning a lot more when you're leading leading on them, wouldn't you? Because you've got a lot more to consider when you're just answering the questions. It feels quite easy. Whereas when you're trying to get information from people, you're trying to make sure you don't bias it in some way and things like that. So mine was from a master's, from my dissertation. I interviewed 10 young people about their plans for further study and if they plan to stay or leave in Blackpool. So my thesis was around the brain drain on deprived communities, basically. And I just found it really interesting because I knew the young people. For some of them I'd been their youth worker, and then like I'd worked alongside some of line managed some others, but I was doing it like in an independent capacity. So that considering your relationship with the participant was so important, because I then sort of, I suppose, looking back now, like if you're asking your apprentice that you line manage if they see their future in Blackpool, they're not going to sit there and go, it's rubbish here, I plan to leave in the next 2 weeks, you know what I mean? So looking back on that, I kind of wonder if I was the most appropriate person to be interviewing. So I'm quite hyper-reflective anyway, so I think, was I the best placed person to do that and stuff? So I found it really, really interesting, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely right. But I think it can be, I think with all situations, it's weighing up what the pros and cons are, because actually the pros are that somebody maybe they trusted as well, or you're able to, so that might have helped as well. And so but as you said, then it's being aware when you're kind of writing up the research actually what limitations might be, and there are always going to be limitations to how you do it. Okay, so we'll just doing that. And then of course thinking about if you are undertaking interviews or focus groups or evaluations more generally, it's thinking about who to involve, and there are lots of sort of different ways you might sort of think about that. So you might be wanting to speak to people with have certain roles or experiences in the project because they're so directly involved, and or they're receiving that support. You may be thinking about things like sort of demographics, or in an area or reaching particular groups, so you're particularly interested in young people. Or there may be some more sort of pragmatic things approaches you might take to thinking about selection. So actually if you're running a focus group, it might be that you go to an existing community group who's already meeting together. And again, that can have some benefits because it's a group who are going to know each other and familiar, so they may feel more comfortable talking about an issue. But in some situations that might not be possible, and you might need to sort of create that group as well. And the other thing that we found really helpful as well is particularly when you're interviewing people, and it's quite challenging to sort of identify who the people are. So for example, we were doing a project about community engagement, and we were going out and speaking to community volunteers, but there wasn't like an obvious list of anywhere of who the volunteers were. So actually by speaking to a couple of initial volunteers who were involved, they were able to say, so and so you might be interested, and they'd sort of pass on the leaflet about research to them. So it was a bit of a snowballing approach as well, so it can sometimes feel a little bit like detective work. And then in terms of finding people, obviously you said you sort of obviously knew some of the individuals who took part, so that might be sort of approaching, going to, as a researcher, I might go to sort of local community organisations and ask for their support with recruiting people to a research project. But you might range through to more kind of using community networks or word of mouth. I think the approaches which are more sort of face-to-face or through networks often do work better than sort of putting something on social media or just a flyer. I think probably is more as that happens with kind of community projects more generally. So the example of the leisure services, we really struggled actually because we initially were sort of putting up posters and so on. In the end, we just had to go and hang around leisure centres, and which was really challenging because people were going to the gym and you just wanted to go straight in, aren't you, and just get in and out, and then try to stop somebody and see if they wanted to take part in a research project. And people did, to be fair, so we'd sort of then give them information in a flyer and tell them a bit more, and they'd get in contact with us if they were sort of interested in taking part. So that did work quite well in the end, but it was quite time intensive in terms of sort of standing around. So what I'm going to do now is, so I've talked for quite long enough, is we've got sort of just a case study here. The projects that, also areas of work that you're working on and wanting to think about evaluation, we can kind of apply these questions to the people's projects as well. So I thought we'd do this when it's kind of initial sort of starter, but then let's look at a couple of projects that you're doing, services, just to hopefully help think through some of the issues that you're facing, because I think that will be relevant to everyone in the group as well. So I think everyone got a case study. So if you just read on using qualitative approaches in a project like this, would it be appropriate? Yeah.
Access, really, IT access. I understand. Oh, stop. Sorry,
I don't hate having a good conversation. Yeah, so we were talking about, just to get have some initial, just brief feedback on how you found that, and any kind of reflections on whether you felt the qualitative approaches were appropriate, or who, and if so, what you felt the people, the participants were, and so on.
Yeah, I think we found that quite a good exercise to do.
Very good, that's good.
Yes.
Over 65 group that I'm feeling very challenged by. But it's very positive. Do you want us to?
Just some brief reflections on what you discussed would be great.
We sort of said that qualitative methods be relevant because you're getting the lived experience of people. You're getting sort of it from them and telling them what they need. They will tell us what they feel is needed by understanding how their experiences. We thought the over 65s obviously were the participants, but the family, the volunteers, the carers, so all of those people to be involved in the process. In fact, looking very positive when I'm saying this.
That's just my face, sorry.
Did we say, what would you want to find out about their experiences?
Maybe we could help you with that one.
Go for it.
We were just thinking about, that would obviously depend on who it was you were speaking to, because for example, if you were speaking to the people that have been receiving these conversations to try and reconnect with different services and so on, then obviously what we'd be wanting to find out is maybe why and what is it that would encourage them to reconnect and so on. But we were thinking then, like your example about working for New Langdales and the positive impact that that's then had on your service and so on, if you were to speak to like volunteers for those VCFSE organisations, you might be wanting to know what impact that's had in terms of how people have engaged with their services. Has it helped build relationships and build trust and so on? So it really, that what you would want to find out about their experience as well, it depends whose experience you're looking for, but irrespective of whose experience you're looking for, there's a lot you could garner from speaking to people.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. They're really helpful reflections from both groups. Thank you.
We did tap in a bit too about limitations and access as well. So we'd want to find out, what the limitations are, what the barriers are, how easy it was to access. So, also
understanding how we've got IT access, that they, all the different sort of. And also, we talked about including, really being mindful of the services, which is probably where I'm coming to, for me particularly, because the services out there, but is it, is there duplication, is there a single point of access for everybody to come to, so they can, all the information is there for them, so it makes it easier. That sort of digress slightly, but there can be duplication that's confusing.
We gave a bit of consideration to point 4 as well, around how would you go about recruiting participants. So we thought this was quite interesting because obviously through the VCFSE organisations, they'll have really people that are used to volunteering their time, so it might be easier to access them. But we were talking a little bit, weren't we, about the fact that for those people that have already spent time trying to connect people back into the community, you might rely on them to be the ones that would mention to those people they've already been working with, oh great, we've been having these chats on the phone or these coffee mornings to get you back involved in stuff. Actually, there's an organisation that's interested in doing a bit of research on this. We've built up a great relationship, would you be up for being involved? And kind of, relying on maybe those volunteers to help you to get access to those people, because they're already the ones that have hopefully built up that trust already. Yeah. So by that point, it should hopefully make it easier for community members that maybe might be a little bit reluctant off their own back to do it, but if they've got somebody or an organisation they've built a relationship with, again, that trust, and they might be a bit more willing, and that always makes your job a little bit easier, doesn't it, as a researcher, if you've got an organisation that's already well respected in the community, getting access to people to be involved, it makes it a bit more straightforward.
And there's also, the BCFSE, they do have their own sort of meetings.
Yeah, like forums and
big,
stuff.
you know,
don't
so
they?
never thought about that actually before, but you know, it's sort of perhaps start where there's already established information sort of thing. But we went down age concern, GPs, health centres, community centres, really getting into the heart of where potentially you would find existing groups.
Yeah, yeah. And I also wondered as well with a project like this whether there's an opportunity to do some more of a co-produced approach as well, so involving older adults or volunteers actually as researchers and providing support, so sort of more of a kind of peer research model as well. Whether I'm not sure if that's what they did, but just when I read it, I wondered if that's something that they could have done. So moving on, does anyone have a project they'd be willing to volunteer for discussion that we could go through these questions with as a group? Or anyone planning an evaluation at the minute they think it would be helpful to kind of talk through their project example?
I'm doing a project at the minute, so it's the partnership. So they're a group of artists that access our service. And from a bit like what you said, during the lockdown, we built up some really good relationships with the artists that run the Grundy, the curator, the volunteers there. So that sort of gives us scope to build on that relationship, eventually bid for funding. So now we've been given funding from the Arts Council. So we have guest artists each week that come and support a small group of clients that now have literally become individual artists within themselves. They've had exhibitions at Manchester, they're in the Grundy at the minute, they're getting individual commissions from other art groups outside of North West, they're getting lots of recognition. But it's sort of like about 2 years old, but I'm sort of, and this is why I'm here, is like how I evaluate that now, like how I sort of capture that. We have lots of online journals, we've got lots of videos, we've got lots of pictures, we've got lots of sort of awareness and things like that, but from a business side, how do I capture that? So, for example, one of our artists, she's blind, she's just been commissioned by like a leading artist who's known internationally, but how do I capture that? Except for documenting it, and there's lots of paperwork that are getting signed off and lots of permissions and things. But other than me logging it each week and week out, I sort of like, how do I evaluate that? So we could maybe use that as an example. I don't know if that would work.
What do other people think?
You could use the other side, like the video side, because it's non-text. So that probably could be a good way of recording, like getting her to record her journey. That way you've got it as played back as well, if there's anything that you miss as well. So that could be a good way of doing it.
Yeah. We do lots of that, like lots of video record, lots of photos, lots of interviews as well. But I think mainly from like a business point of view. So obviously the funding's going to run out at some point. So how do I sort of build up an evidence-based like sort of business?
That's the impact of what we've given.
Yeah,
back to where we started really, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we measure the impact? How do we document that? Which is normally, to be fair, to government funding.
I suppose it goes back to what you're trying to evidence, like what do you want to show? Because that would, for me, would be a really important question, because that will help you decide how you want to evaluate. So what is it you're trying to capture?
Like just sort of the individual journey, how this is impacted on individuals, whether it be mental health. You know, there's lots of positive things that come from it. There's been lots of opportunities for these as individuals rather than service users who access a service. So I refer to this group as artists, because they're artists, you know, and they're right, they've got work. And another thing as well, when they go and do these exhibitions, there's no knowledge of a learning disability. Nobody is aware that these artists have a learning disability. And I was very keen to keep that.
Inclusivity is really valuable.
Yeah. So like we had a workshop at Manchester Contemporary last year, and it was like 8,000 footfall that had gone to visit the art room from the partnership artists, but all of those thousands of people would not know these have a learning disability, because it's not anywhere unless you physically meet the artist, and even then you might not know, you know. So I don't know, it's more of like,
It's only a little bit, but I went to do, well, use a survey really, but I went to, for want of a better word, a soup kitchen style frontline, we call them. And that was really well organised. They bring them in and they sit down and have some food. And I was chatting away, laterally near the end, this gentleman sat with one of the volunteers, who was obviously communicating and sort of saying the same things. You know, what difference does it make for you coming here, sort of thing. And it was through that communication that this gentleman had through COVID been very, very isolated, very lonely, had a brother but didn't see him very often in Blackpool. And they'd done something in relation to, oh that was it, she went around and asked them, so what is your strength? What do you like to do? He said he liked to paint. So we started bringing in the paintings that he did. And they applied for funding and they made calendars from his. And I mean, if you saw him on the street, you would question, you know, but he was so proud. And whether people think it's good, bad, or different, the value to that man and being involved with that was it was just immeasurable. I don't think you could, it's just immeasurable because now he goes to other groups and you know he actually shows people what he does, which I think is immeasurable, really. So it's like the art thing just moved me. You know, and these are sort of hidden things that you know without coming in for food, that would never happen. Well, you know, it's
I think that's such a come back to your question about how we measure the impact. I think your examples are such a valuable one about how actually qualitative approaches or research more generally, it's not always about external people coming in and doing the interviews, isn't it? You're collecting that sort of through your everyday work. So I think it's how the best way of trying to capture that as you can, so that sort of isn't lost as well, which can be really challenging when you're delivering the service. But things you can think as well, because actually an interview can be actually just a 10-minute informal conversation with someone. I think the main important thing, obviously, with any research is being really clear about why, if you are having that conversation and being clear with that person, actually we would like to use that. You offer kind of feedback as part of understanding the impact of that service.
I think it's causes for causes, isn't it? You know, it's like I said, sometimes the people that, particularly if I go out into the front line, so to speak, you know, they're very cautious. You know, for their own whatever reason, they're being cautious. So it's having that sort of, it has to be quite informal.
Exactly,
Presented informally.
I liked your point there about potentially maybe co-producing things a little bit more. So, like for example, if you're a little bit unsure about what you'd like to capture around this, the partnership and the artwork and so on, then maybe just starting with a conversation with your group and saying, look, I think we've got a story here that's worth sharing and worth celebrating. Like, how do we capture that? Because they might then help you. It almost seems to make sense to me that if they're all these brilliant artists and that's what they're really passionate about, is there a way you could share your story and share your learning through an arts-based sort of method that allows you to capture things before and after maybe and things? But if you're a little bit, I think that's one thing, that being really comfortable with not knowing and just taking it to the group, and because you might say to them, I think we should be evaluating this in some way, this seems really great and something worth shouting about, and they might say, absolutely don't want to, we just really enjoy coming in. Or they might say, oh no, we really do, maybe we could do it in this way and that way. So if you feel a little bit unsure, go off them as well. You making the point about co-producing things, like, we advocate for that quite a lot, don't we? Just go and speak to the community and say, what do you think?
Is that capacity-wise, we did have the capacity?
So we do the focus groups there every month, because we're across 2 buildings, so we'll do teams every month. We'll get the Grundy involved, we might get sort of our operational leads involved. So we do a lot of that, but there's only so much, like you were saying, obviously there's capacity that we can run with, if you will. Everything's documented, and we had one last week, we had a meeting last week and we was asked, what would you like to, I'd like to have more trips out. I'd like to go, visit more art galleries. So I can see the progress in that, because 2 years ago, I'd asked this group, what do you want to do? I like to paint, I like to use clay, I like to, even things that wasn't relevant, I like to cook, I like to, these are just the general conversations, whereas now, 2 years down the line, it's like, well, I'd like to go and visit more galleries, I'd like to go and do more work out at the centre, so we've done a lot of stuff, whether it just be going out in the gardens and painting, and we've had a lot more guest speakers in. We've got a lot more, so we're now moving to like digital artwork. So we are sort of moving and progressing, and it's really doing really well. But just like, so I've just read through these thinking, tailoring it to the partnership, and it does make sense now. I know I'm sort of like going off a bit, but reading this now, it does make sense what I do. So we do a lot of learning circles and reflective practice as well. So that taps into this, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So actually, yeah.
So they give you a running session, like, sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to try. I have this visual of a journey. So this is where they start on their journey, and these are the things that they do, but it's a visual. It's more like pictorial, so they will start with painting, and then they go to an art gallery. So it's almost like a visual journey of where they I have a different scenarios, you know, but it's I've watched videos of caricature style things where they've brought it out, and I've just got this in my head that it would be like have you seen the Better Start ones with the grain things on it? I've just got this visual that this is where they started on the street, and they went to get food, and then but I just thought that'd be quite powerful.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it was really short. I just need the substance to be. I know it's there, and I know it's just how to. I quite like that sort of concept. I think I need some actually.
I think that can work really well, and actually use. I mean, I think you're going to be doing a session around creative approaches, aren't you?
On 25th July. Yeah, it's
Oh,
about
so
creative
That's
methods,
the next one.
using creative methods.
Will somebody send me that information, or can I
Yes,
just...
we can, yeah.
Yeah, oh, perfect, thank you.
That would be really
I
relevant for
think
yours
that's,
as
yeah,
well.
that's going to be really good for
We will
me.
circulate information.
But I'd like to do that because it's certainly something I could discuss with our CEO.
I think with the project example you're talking
Yeah.
about as well, it sounds like the starting point is just being focused on what we're wanting to find out from the evaluation if we're undertaking an evaluation or to inform the funding or for other purposes. But I guess and it sounds like because you have collected a lot of information already through the project, it's almost looking at what do we already have to sort of start answering those questions.
Yeah.
But it may be that actually you can't look at all of it. Maybe you could look at, if you've collected information at the start, as you talked about, so it's almost like that's the start of people's journeys. You can, paint it just to provide to capture, explain what the situation was then in terms of people's confidence or experience of art. But then if then as people have gone through that journey, if you've got existing information that you can use to sort of to describe the changes, it's, as you said, it's sort of telling that sort of that story over time. But then if you have got capacity to do some additional work, which might be some one-to-one conversations with the artists, or using your kind of group self-reflections, you could sort of build in some of the questions about people's experiences and the sort of difference they felt it made to those. And I guess with that, it's just being clear with people that we'd like to use these kind of conversations as part of our evaluation, so people are aware that information is being kind of reported.
So I recently created sort of like feedback forms for the individuals to complete themselves. Really easy read, simple forms. It might just be a tick box exercise. It might be that they have some support in documenting what they've got from that session. So I've started doing that over the last few weeks. So I'm thinking that's going to build up a good, evidence base as well. And it's their sort of their comments, what they feel they've got from the session and where they want it to go forward. But I think really I should have used Nibbles as my example. Nibbles rather than the partnership arm. Because we've got Nibbles it's a training cafe, so it's for those who maybe train and eventually we're hoping to support them into employment. But that's sort of never been done before, and it's a new thing to us. So if somebody would join Nibbles, they might be there for 10 years. And they would build different skills and they would do different areas, whether it be front of house, whether it be cooking, whether it be preparing food or tills, things like that. But whereas now we want to sort of complete the journey, so now we're supporting people, whether it be in other services like the ARC or the kitchens, Blackpool and Fylde College, to go in and do a bit of work experience and then eventually support them whether it to be do a portfolio, a CV, and then into employment. But this is new, we haven't got anybody who's done that yet.
Yeah.
But we're sort of doing a pilot scheme at the minute with a one lady. So she's sort of done all the training now with catering stuff that she needs to do, that she passed it all. And now she's going to go and do visits at like the Ark and things in the kitchen there. And then hopefully we can support her into employment. So I think this really would, that's more of a better example of how we can zone into that rather than the artist, because that's sort of more a bit creative, like you said.
I like the artist one. I think National Lottery will love you.
They would, yeah.
What do you do?
In any case, I think asking the right question, good questions, is important, right? You are interested in the impact of it, right? So maybe you can formulate some questions around that to, you know, without leading them, as Sam mentioned. Like, do you think there is any improvement in your life, within yourself, after you join in this project, or in what ways, for instance, without leading them, if there is anything, or maybe you wouldn't even say improvement, you would say change. Have you observed any changes, you know, in what ways? So yeah, you're already collecting lots of data actually, it's just, you know, asking the right question maybe, more, you know, impact oriented, you know, so you can get some information around that, and maybe not even, you know, complex analysis for this, but you can present some cases to the funders. For instance, in the future, like, you know, people have said that, like, you know, after being involved in this project, they have said this, you know, they observe this kind of changes. And this data doesn't necessarily need to come only from themselves, from individuals, but you can also ask your colleagues, you know, service providers, like, you know, have you observed any changes in people that you are working with? In what ways, you know, why do you think these changes happen?
I'm just writing all this down.
Could I just ask a question as well? Sorry, it might just be that I'm not quite understanding, but it's just fascinating for me the way you're sort of like pitching it. It's like just dead interesting, because like, so I worked at Head Start, for example, and now the HMRC, so it's kind of, we're being funded by the National Lottery and then obviously now the NIHR. So it's quite clear to us that they will ask us to report back and feedback on certain things and evaluate certain things. So I was kind of wondering, because you've said sort of like, I've got all this data and sort of not really sure what to do with it almost. So who's your audience in terms of, are you looking to evaluate because you've got funders, because senior leaders are asking you to, or is it just that your motivation is, oh, we've kind of got all this data and we've not really been sure why we've collected it? Because normally people feel the need to evaluate something because there's a pressure there, but I'm kind of not getting that from you. So I'm really interested to learn more about what's your motivation, because that can be quite important in terms of how we evaluate as well, can't it? Like, what's motivated us to look into this a little bit more?
Well, I think probably all of those things that you said.
Okay.
So like we have the Arts Council, so obviously we have to evidence what we're doing over a space of time, to sort of, this is what we're doing, this is where your funding is, whether it be trips out, whether it be transport, whether it be other guest artists that we've asked to come, asked to visit, so whether photography, digital art, whether accessing other galleries, things like that. But for me, my sort of motivation is the team. They're my motivation, they inspire me. But it's just, for me, it's about awareness. About just getting it out there, that what these individuals as artists can achieve, rather than, so majority of those artists have accessed Langdale for 20 years and sort of stayed a bit stagnant, if you will. And not, you know, everyone's different, everyone has different motivations, but I'm quite creative like that, so when I come, I've only been there 3 years, I was like, this is great, where are we going next? Whereas others might be like, this is great, let's continue this, let's keep doing this for the next 10 years, where I was like, this is great, what's next? What else can we achieve? So some of the artists, probably 9 out of 10 of the artists, have sold artwork now. So they're getting commissioned, they're selling artworks, they're getting paid for their artwork. So to me, that's massive. It's a massive achievement. And you know, there was other things I did, so I had to speak to like direct payment and things like that. There was a lot of legwork about ensuring no one's benefits was going to be impacted and things like that. So we sort of did a lot of work behind the scenes, but
And that would be invaluable learning for other people, wouldn't it, looking to do similar. So that's why I was asking about motivation, because Bouquet was saying there could even be a little bit of evaluating you do around that, around your process of working with direct payment, or like why do you run loads. So that's why I was then interested who was asking you to evaluate and why and stuff.
Yeah, no, I think really it's me. I'm sort of questioning these now, and my manager is really supportive, and she's more about data, KPIs, things like that. Yeah, so really encouraging. But obviously she's got a role. She's got her management technique. So we work really well together, because I sort of do all the open day events, going out doing all the networking, sort of engaging and bringing people in, and then she's really good at supporting me about how to get it down, how to document it.
Yeah, how do we keep the doors open, keep the funding coming in. Yeah. So
we work well, but I think all of those things you said, you know, from a service point of view, from a personal and a professional point of view, and my personal development as well.
Sure.
You know, there's all, I consider all of those things. But the main focus is obviously how far I can support these individuals as artists. You know, it might be that they no longer need to access our service because they're too busy doing art fairs, doing whatever it is that they're doing. So they might get, I don't know, like this holistic approach, like they might get everything they need from that, stimulation, socialising, all of that stuff, that they don't need to come to Langrail anymore.
And I guess when it comes to the evaluation, it's being kind of clear about what's realistic within your capacity to do and what you have to, need to prioritise. But then, are there then opportunities to link with people, researchers who've got interests in your field, to then to look at, can we get some additional funding to do some more research to explore some of the more the emerging things that you're starting to see from the project, which would be really valuable for other areas, or extending the project in future.
So like there was a young lady who's part of the Grundy now. She's a learning, like an ambassador learning educator officer. I can't remember her full title, but she's been made aware of the partnership now, and she's really tapping in. So she comes every week. So and she sort of opens doors for more like the learning side of it, rather than just the artwork. Like the development. So it's raised a lot of awareness. A lot of awareness.
I think when we talk about this particular scenario here, the case study that you gave us, for me that links very much about the KPIs for the funding that we've got, that we have to evidence what we've done about it in a specific area, is looking at making sure everybody knows where to go to get food. Maybe trying to, I say maybe because but you don't want to have duplication. But also it's not just about the food, it's just, if they come through the door for food, like that man ended up painting, we got funding and the gallery or something. So the food is almost like the hook. But what happens, so without that, so I suppose the value, evaluating the value of, what has that food actually given them opportunity to have, whether that's drug or housing or whatever other services they need.
It's like that gets them there, but that's not why they're there almost. Like, it's the same like youth work, isn't it, when you put like a youth club, like, people go because there's snacks and some of their mates are there, but there's often a more underlying reason as to why they're going as well.
Very sensitive, isn't it? It's a fundamental need, is food. And I've seen some very, very hungry people, so it's very sensitive. And, when you're talking to them, they can, such a lot, but it's how to capture that. But without them having, there was, I go to one and a lady was able to access counselling quicker because there's a visiting counselling service, So it's just sort of those pieces, but it's the food is the draw of hunger. Human need, isn't it? They're hungry, they go in. You went to Comfort Cafe, but you went to Sequel.
Yes.
And I think what you were talking about, there's sort of those are more informal conversations where you can talk to people in a not in a formal interview setting, and that's
sit down and have
a cup of tea. And I think often evaluation it gets seen as something that happens at the end of a project, but actually it can be happening all the way through. And if if you're kind of consciously thinking about that when people, volunteers are going out or staff are interacting with people, that's as I think somebody said, it's people who are providing those services as well can reflect and record their experiences as well of the changes that are happening. Brilliant. So what we'll do now, I think we're aiming to finish by 12. I think that's correct, isn't it? But I've got we'll move on to looking at some data. So I've got a bit of a transcript, not a full transcript, of from an interview that I did a while ago.
Sorry, when was the next workshop? The next creative workshop?
25th of July.
25th of July.
Yes.
Yes, just have a quick read through that. We'll come back to it, but it just gives an example of. This is from an interview that I carried out a few years ago now, where we were looking at the effectiveness of community engagement approaches. It was part of a major regeneration programme called New Deal for Communities, which was funded many years ago now. So one of the challenges for us is that we were doing it a bit retrospectively, because we, like you, there was lots of data that had been collected through the programme, but no one had really looked at the impacts on health and well-being. So as part of that, we were kind of interested in actually understanding the role of community engagement within that programme as well. So this was from a community worker who had been quite heavily involved in the programme. Yes, I'll carry on, I think. So we've talked a lot about data already, and all the examples people have been talking about are all about data. So this is an example of a very small amount of data from just one interview. I think the overall interview is probably about 30 pages in the end. So it's actually just speaking to somebody for 45 minutes an hour can produce a lot of information, which is something just to be conscious of. I think just some of the practicalities. I think that can be quite challenging. I think when it's it's self-evaluation, you've not got an external evaluator coming in, a researcher, or you're collecting that data yourself, and sort of thinking about ways of how you can capture that information more creatively as well. So traditionally, if I'm doing an interview, I would be asking for permission to record the session, and I might sort of take a few notes during the session, but it's always a bit off-putting, isn't it, if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're busy there sort of writing lots of notes. So I would try and rely mainly on sort of my memory, and then have the recording to be able to create a written record, which I could use as part of then the analysis and write-up of the project. So we'll talk a bit about tips for doing that as well. So basically, when we're talking about analysing, say, qualitative data, what we're doing is sort of looking through often quite a lot of data. So it might be a number of transcripts from interviews we've conducted, or it might be sort of data that you've already collected through your kind of your COVID example, but then just finding a way of structuring that in a way in which you can start to make sense and put out sort of themes and patterns So yes, I think you sort of both talked about some examples of ways of doing that. So looking for kind of key words and phrases that were coming out, and that's you can sort of, as you said, you can present that visually then for people to start to highlight key themes. So with qualitative data, we can sort of go through this just for a few minutes. You might be wanting to kind of go through this and start to sort of highlight sort of key words or phrases which are jumping out at you. And then you would be starting to think about, well, how can I sort of organise that in a way which I can start to compare, say, across, say, I've done 10 interviews with community workers. I'd want to look at how the different issues that they're saying, are they similar, different in relation to a particular issue. And as I gave the example of the leisure project, as well as, for example, although affordability and cost was like the primary thing we were interested in, we wanted to understand how did that relate to other things that affected people's abilities to be active. So I think with analysis it's a bit of a balance between keeping the focus on what you need to, what's critical to find out, and that will be guided by the questions you're trying to answer. So it's about understanding the difference it made. You might be looking for particular examples related to that, but you would maybe also be interested in other themes and issues which you want to sort of start then going through very systematically, I guess, when you're reading that information. So that's often what we call sort of coding. So we might go into looking at the data with some set ideas about what we want to find out. So we might have some initial what we call themes that we're interested in. So for example, with leisure, we were interested in what people say about affordability, for example. But then as you start to read the information you've gathered, you'll see actually that might be talked about in very different ways by different groups of people. So people didn't just sort of talk about leisure centres being affordable or not. It was actually, there was, people had sort of used different strategies for that. They said, well, it'd be affordable, if I can go twice a week, but then I need to sort of top up to go sort of, I can pay to go twice a week, but then I need to sort of use a free leisure to go a bit more often because I can't afford to go sort of 5 times a week. So you start to sort of explore the more kind of detail that's coming through. So for example, with the art project, it said some of the things you might be expecting to see because you've asked people specific questions about that. But as you were describing, there have been other things that started to come through about people's experiences which you might not have thought about as well. So for this example, just for a couple of minutes, if people have had a chance to just read it through quickly. So this, what does this tell you about people's approaches to community engagement and the experiences of that? Or what kind of words or phrases would immediately sort of jump out at you? Negative. Yeah, absolutely. That's really important.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think for me, obviously, being like a youth worker, but almost having more of a research role now in the HTRC, just almost like clash of almost like professionalisms in terms of like the researcher would be, there needs to be ethics and this and that and so on, and here you're reading a community worker going, oh, we just knocked on anyone's door, just anyone that would kind of listen to us, and almost just that sort of, that bit more of a just community focus of just go out and see what happens, sort of a less guarded, sort of more sort of like rigid approach maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
Which I understand why research is, obviously there are different sort of things, but just that initial, well, let's just go out and speak to people first and sort of see what happens. Like throwing caution to the wind, just like community work, just go out and do it. Like.
Yeah.
And I think that's justified because then you get a really clear picture from the community. We're knocking on people's doors, we listen to them, things are slowed down, so people were getting frustrated, they tended to shout at people that were knocking on their door because of that. But actually, we listened to them, it gave them a chance to find out what was going on, and then that last line, so that's how a lot of people in the community actually became engaged. It was a platform for them just to air their concerns. And so I was kind of highlighting that chronology of we knocked on people's doors, they were upset. Through being upset and listening to them, we got a chance to also hear them. The community were heard, and it gave us a chance to promote different projects. And then they engaged a little bit more. This kind of like tells a nice little story, doesn't it?
absolutely, yeah. So is there anything else that people wanted to add to that? Back in.
I think probably, like you said, the way they came on the door, I think most people, either you've been away, you've just gone to bed or something. But I think the reason why I think they slowed down to engage, I think probably because it's the way it says, do you know it's a project or something we can link you up to. So it could be an important about the services. I think had it been, for example, I get normal something trying to sell you something, it probably gone a different case of doors shutting. But I think because they're trying to say there's something in your community that you might have not heard of, I think that's probably why they probably stood there probably a bit longer to engage with. That's what I would do.
Yeah. That's really interesting point. Yeah. So when we were doing these interviews, one of the things we were particularly interested in understanding is the approaches the areas were taking to community engagement, and that seemed to be very different across different neighbourhoods. So we use the interviews to understand that a bit better, and this gives, as you said, that gives you that chronology of how the approach they took. And then for our evaluation, we were able to then start to group different areas, to say into areas that took sort of similar approaches. So you had some areas who just, all they did in terms of their engagement was consultation. So they'd be deciding to sort of knock down lots of housing, and then they'd just be going out and consulting the community on that. So as you can imagine, lots of kind of frustrations around that, through to other approaches where they were being more proactive and trying to take approaches which were more empowering and engage the community in the redevelopment work, so they had ownership of it. So that was useful in that we are then being able to look at, did those different approaches have different impacts for the community? But what also came through this interview, and I think somebody picked up about the negative impact, was actually the effects on particularly volunteers involved and community workers, and about the stress that could cause as well, and the kind of the negative effects. So I think often community engagement can be sort of seen as always a positive outcome for well-being or volunteering, but it's also showing actually the support that needed to be in place as well for people when they were kind of dealing with quite stressful situations. So some community workers are also living in the area as well, and then they'd be going down the pub or going to the local shop, and then have people being so frustrated about the regeneration, venting all their frustrations on them as well. So again, so it's going back to the start, that it was about those interviews were very much about, I suppose, capturing that experience of that community engagement as well.
That's interesting. I bet that was a brilliant piece of work.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah,
it was. Really challenging to identify people though, because the funding had ended, so there weren't necessarily staff in place. It was a lot of using people's contacts to sort of try and identify the best people.
How often do you find then that people get to the point of only after it's done being like, oh, maybe we should have done something about that, no, maybe we should have captured that in some way, sort of. Does that happen?
Doing the research.
Yeah,
but it comes down to practicalities and funding, isn't it? And
sure.
if your funder doesn't fund evaluation or
Sure.
research assigned, then there's a limit to what you can do, isn't it, within existing services. But as we've talked about, it sounds like you're all collecting a huge amount of information or evidence already. So it's about how we make best use of that existing evidence, and then can to build on that with additional research as well.
Think outside the box, what are the additional benefits?
Sorry.
Just thinking outside the box, really, on these additional little snippets that could potentially, when you look at it all, it might be a trend, that's something that you hadn't gone in to find that was hidden. That's pertinent, because mental health is high on the agenda, so it's always coming out wherever I go. But I suppose I was aware of that, but there's a huge piece of evidence of information that is sort of in addition to
And some of we're working with sort of citizens advice at the minute around some of the services they're delivering, particularly around financial support that I think started during COVID and then have continued. So we've been exploring with them how they might be able to use some existing tools which measure things like sort of people's well-being or mental health or health more generally, and if they can sort of build those into so they're not necessarily qualitative approaches, they're more about sort of measuring, be able to gather some measures of people's well-being at the start of a service, and then over time, so they're exploring the ways of how that could be built into the assessments that they do at the start, or their kind of initial meetings with people, and then whether as researchers we could sort of work with them to do some follow-ups with people over time as well. So there's some existing tools as well, which I can sort of share links to as well, which may or may not be so appropriate for services as well, which can sort of help with capturing that evidence as well. But just as we come to an end, I think some of the kind of the key points I think of our experiences are that it's really easy to generate lots of data, and it can feel really daunting when you sort of sat in front of it trying to make sense of it all. And of course I'm speaking as somebody who is researching, full time. That's my job, so I have that time to do that, and I appreciate that's not the case for a lot of people who are trying to evaluate within their day jobs as well. So I think it's that thing about sort of keeping it really focused and realising that you've really got there's really lots you could look at and answer. But if you're looking at sort of, I suppose if you're looking at maybe collecting additional data and qualitative data, thinking about what are the key sort of things that we really want to sort of focus on, and keeping it focused on that. And then it's also kind of like reaching out as well to universities or other organisations about actually are there other people in these institutions who would be interested in supporting maybe a longer term research project which would provide you with a bit more capacity, or maybe link you with a master's student who could sort of spend that time going through all the data you already have collected. So I think that it's always worth kind of hopefully sort of reaching out to people and seeing if there are kind of ways of bringing in extra support as well for that. But what I will do is, just to conclude, I'll share those so we can sort of look through those. Yeah. I just wanted to focus on now the last couple of minutes, just a website that you might find useful, just from sort of, I suppose, reflecting on what people have talked about in terms of their experiences. So the more generic guides I've suggested around like things like the Social Research Association, and then specific guides to evaluation, and these slides will be kind of go around, I think, won't they? So
Yes.
Don't worry about taking down the links. What I think, just from your experiences and what you've been talking about, I would look at is called Evaluation Support Scotland. Has anyone come across it? Possibly not, because they're in Scotland. But that's where I used to be based, and I worked a lot with them. But they've got a real focus on working with VCFSE organisations, but also funders, so trying to improve how you report, so how funders can their expectations for reporting. But they've also produced quite a lot of useful guides. So, for example, that's sort of their homepage. And they've got like a resources section here, which I think the vast majority are free to download and use. So that's where that kind of community connecting case study came from. So you can filter them or sort of search for keywords if you're interested in a particular topic. And I know that's something that had to come up at the start, which I haven't had a lot of time to talk about, is I guess that process of reporting and how you bring that information together. So they've got some tips and examples of how to sort of tell your story, particularly when that's aiming at reporting for funders as well, and so how you might sort of bring together the data you already have in your organisation. So that's probably one of the organisations that I always go back to as well, and they just have some really kind of useful information and support. I've never come across anything quite like that in England. Are you aware of organisations who sort of provide evaluation support or resources for, particularly sort of aimed at sort of community voluntary third sector organisations?
I do individually, but not related to the research centre that I'm working for at the moment.
No. So maybe it's a gap. But I hope it's been really interesting sort of hearing more about what you're doing. And I know 2 hours isn't a lot to try and cover everything. So my email is on the slides as well. So if you do have anything you wanted to follow up or questions afterwards, please feel do get in touch, because I think actually across most of your topics I can probably think of researchers who are kind of linked into these sort of things that you're doing as well.